things are not the wrath of God. And neither was the Exodus. In my previous video, I described a natural catastrophe, a celestial weather event like Tunguska that destroyed the ancient Egyptian city of Tanis. And I also described some of the first-hand accounts of the Egyptians who had their own stories about what happened during this event. So due to popular demand, I'm going to read more from these accounts. The dark days began with the last visitation of the destroyer, and they were foretold by strange omens in the skies. The days of stillness were followed by a time when noise of trumpeting and shrilling was heard in the heavens. Dust and smoke clouds darkened the sky and colored the waters upon which they fell with a bloody hue. Plague was throughout the land. The river was bloody and blood was everywhere. The water was vile and men's stomachs shrank from the drinking. Those who did drink from the river vomited it up, for it was polluted. The dust tore wounds in the skin of man and beast. In the glow of the destroyer, the earth was filled with redness. Vermin bred and filled the air and face of the earth with loathsomeness. Trees throughout the land were destroyed, and no herb or fruit was to be found. The face of the land was battered and devastated by a hail of stones, which smashed down all that stood in the path of the torrent. They swept down in hot showers, and strange flowing fire ran along the ground in their wake. The fish of the river died in the polluted waters. Worms, insects, and reptiles sprang up from the earth in huge numbers. Great gusts of wind brought swarms of locusts which covered the sky, and the destroyer flung itself through the heavens. It blew great gusts of cinders across the face of the land. The gloom of a long night spread a dark mantle of blackness, which extinguished every ray of light. None knew when it was day and when it was night, for the sun cast no shadow. The darkness was not a clean blackness of night, but a thick darkness in which the breath of men was stopped in their throats. Men gasped in a hot cloud of vapor which enveloped all the land and snuffed out all the lamps and fires. Men were benumbed and lay moaning in their beds. None spoke to one another or took food, for they were overwhelmed with despair. Ships were sucked away from their moorings and destroyed in great whirlpools. It was a time of undoing. The earth turned over as clay spun upon a potter's wheel. The whole land was filled with uproar from the thunder of the destroyer overhead and the cry of the people. The dues of Pharaoh could not be collected, for there was neither wheat nor barley, goose nor fish. The rights of Pharaoh could not be enforced, for the fields of grain and the pastures were destroyed. The highborn and the lowly prayed together, that life might come to an end, and the turmoil of thundering ceased to beat upon their ears. Terror was the companion of men by day, and horror their companion by night. Men lost their senses and became mad. They were distracted by frightfulness. On the great night of the destroyer's wrath, when its terror was at its height, there was a hail of rocks, and the earth heaved in pain and rent her bowels. Gates, columns, and walls were consumed by fire, and the statues of gods were overthrown and broken. People fled outside their dwellings in fear and were slain by the hail. The highborn ones perished in the midst of the ruins, and all the strength of the land was stricken. Even the great one, the firstborn of Pharaoh, died with the highborn in the midst of the terror and falling stones. The children of princes were cast out into the streets, and those who were not cast out died within their abodes. There were 9 days of darkness and upheaval, while a tempest raged such as never had been known before. When it passed away, brother buried brother throughout the land. Men rose up against those in authority and fled from the cities to dwell in tents in the outlands. Egypt lacked great men to deal with the times. The people were weak from fear. Gold, silver, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and copper were taken by the Habiru. To their priests they gave chalices, urns, and ornaments. Pharaoh alone remained calm and strong in the midst of the confusion. The people turned to wickedness and weakness in their despair. The Habiru, spared by the destroyer, left the accursed land forthwith. Their multitude moved in the gloom of the half-dawn under the mantle of a fine swirling gray ash, leaving the burnt fields and shattered cities behind them. In 7 days the accursed ones journeyed to the waters. They crossed the heaving wilderness while the hills melted around them. Above, the skies were torn from lightning. They were sped by terror, but their feet became entangled in the land, and the wilderness shut them in. They knew not the way, for no sign was constant before them. They came up against the waters which blocked their way, and their hearts were in despair. The night was a night of fear and dread, for there was a high moaning above, and black winds from the underworld were loosed. Fire sprang up from the ground. The hearts of the Habiru shrank within them, for they knew the wrath of Pharaoh followed them, and that there was no way to escape. They hurled abuse on those who led them, Strange rites were performed along the shore that night, and the Habiru disputed among themselves, and there was violence. Pharaoh had gathered his army and followed the Habiru. After he departed, there were riots and disorders behind him, for the cities were plundered. Pharaoh pressed on in sorrow, for behind him was all desolation and death. Before him were things he could not understand, and he was afraid. But he carried himself well and stood before his host with courage. He sought to bring back the Habiru, for the people said that they had taken all the treasures of Egypt. The host of Pharaoh came upon the Habiru by the saltwater shores, but was held back from them by a breath of fire. A great cloud was spread over the host and darkened the sky. None could see except for the fiery glow and the unceasing lightnings which rent the covering clouds overhead. A gale raged all night, and in the red twilight dawn there was movement of the earth. The waters receded from the seashore and were rolled back upon themselves. There was a strange silence, and then, in the gloom, it was seen that the waters had parted, leaving a passage between. The land had risen, but it was disturbed and trembled. The way was not straight and clear. The waters about were as if spun within a bowl. The swampland alone remained undisturbed. From the horn of the destroyer came the high shrilling noise which stopped the ears of men. The Habiru had been making sacrifices in despair. Their lamentations were loud. Now, before the strange sight, there were hesitations and doubts. For the space of a breath, they stood still and silent. Then all was confusion and shouting, some pressing forward into the waters against all who sought to flee back from the unstable ground. Then, in the exaltation, the leader led them into midst of the waters through the confusion. Yet many sought to turn back into the host behind them, while others fled along the empty shores. Still, the host of Pharaoh held its ranks, firm in resolve before the strange and awful happenings, and undaunted by the fury which raged by their side. Stern faces were lit darkly by the fiery curtain. Then the fury departed, and there was silence. Stillness spread over the land, while the host of Pharaoh stood without movement in the red glow. Then, with a shout, the captains went forward, and the host rose up behind them. The curtain of fire had rolled up into a dark billowing cloud which spread out as a canopy. There was a stirring of the waters, but they followed the evildoers past the place of the great whirlpool. The passage was confused in the midst of the waters, and the ground beneath unstable. Here, in the midst of the tumult of the waters, Pharaoh fought against the hindmost of the Habiru and prevailed over them. And there was a great slaughter amid the sand, the swamp, and the water. The Habiru cried out in despair, but their cries were unheeded. Then the stillness was broken by a mighty roar, and through the rolling pillars of cloud the wrath of the destroyer descended upon the hosts. The heavens roared as with 1,000 thunders, and the bowels of the earth were sundered, and earth shrieked its agony. The cliffs were torn away and cast down. The dry ground fell beneath the waters, and great waves broke upon the shore, sweeping in rocks from the seaward. The great surge of rocks and waters overwhelmed the chariots of the Egyptians who went before the footmen. The chariot of the Pharaoh was hurled into the air as if by a mighty hand and was crushed in the midst of the rolling waters. Tidings of the disaster had come back by messenger, who brought reports unto the people that the host had been destroyed by blast and deluge. The invaders came up out of the land of the gods, because the wrath of heaven also laid their land to waste. There too had been a plague of reptiles and ants, signs and omens, and an earthquake. There also had been turmoil and disaster, disorder and famine, with the gray breath of the destroyer sweeping the ground and stopping the breath of men. The hearts of the Egyptians were faint within them. Their spirits were no longer strong, and they fell away. Deserted by the gods above and below, their dwellings destroyed, their households scattered, they were as men already half dead. Their hearts were still filled with terror, and with the memory of the wrath which had struck them from out of heaven. They were still filled with the memory of the fearsome sight of the destroyer, and they knew not what they did. The children of darkness defiled the temples and ravished women. They enslaved all who were left, old, young, men, and boys. They oppressed the people, and they delighted in mutilation and torture. So, bit of a different story than what you heard in Sunday school, isn't it? The wrath of God did not destroy the Egyptians. It did not cause the Exodus. There was a massive natural catastrophe with an unprecedented loss of millions of lives. What would you feel like if somebody came in during a fire or a flood or another natural disaster and took everything you owned and took off? That is exactly what was done to one of the greatest, most beneficent, and decent human civilizations that ever graced this planet.